Hi, welcome to this week's episode of A&N In Depth. My name is Jennifer, and I am here with, as always, my friend Sam, who is here with us, and also Paul Douglas, who is our Director of Auditing Services here at the General Conference. Last week, Sam and Paul, we talked about what makes a good leader. We had a very great, awesome conversation with Brad about what makes a good leader, and now we're going even further in depth. And we're doing that because of our continued emphasis on the I Will Go strategic plan and the leadership objective number 10, which says to enhance transparency. I just lost it. To enhance transparency, accountability, and credibility of denominational organization operations and mission objectives. So it looks like we are going to be placing an emphasis on leaders with integrity. And so Sam and Paul, we'll start with you. What does it mean when we make this part of our emphasis to have leaders who are transparent and with integrity?
Well, thank you, Jennifer, and thanks for inviting me as part of this A&N in-depth discourse. And as you look at integrity, and actually, let's look at I will go statement number 10. I believe that is so centrally a part of the strategic plan of the church, because without proper leadership, without proper integrity and transparency, the resources that are going to be necessary to fund that mission are not going to come. Yes, you could say, well, people are given to the Lord and they will return their tithes and their offerings, but there is a person in between their response to God and their obedience to God, and that's the leader. Whether or not he or she does the right thing, the right way, at the right time. So I believe integrity is significant to this I Will Go strategic plan in terms of leaders and the role that they play that will build the confidence in the members in the pew.
Yeah, I think this question of integrity, this question of truth, is really important, even from a foundational perspective. It's a very old principle that it's truth that brings order out of chaos. It is spoken truth, that when you speak the truth, when you are in line with reality, that something incredible happens and order comes out of chaos. And of course, for a Christian organization, truth really matters. You have a commitment with truth. And in fact, the Bible goes as far as to say that the father of lies is Satan, the dragon, the serpent.
Correct, yeah.
And anything that is not truthful, anything that is a lie, does not belong to God. It belongs to Satan. I mean, it doesn't get more,
very distinct.
Very distinct. There can be no question about this. So every time you speak the truth, you are aligning yourself with the divine, with the logos, with what is good. And every time that you say something, that you do something that is not truthful, that is trying to conceal or to hide then you are aligning yourself with Satan. And in this great controversy, especially for Seventh-day Adventists, every action matters, every word matters, every signature matters, every action matters. And so it's not, and Paul is absolutely right. If we don't align ourselves with truth, there is no way we're going to finish this mission. Yeah. And all the resources will go in the wrong direction, so I think this is a fundamental issue to deal with.
Right now I always feel like Christianity in the U.S., especially evangelical Christianity and Christian leaders, are under a microscope. And we talked about this a little bit last week, Sam, and that is that in the past few months, a lot of Christian leaders have had to step down for lack of integrity, right? We had the head of Hillsong here in the U.S. or in New York have to step down for extramarital affair, and then Jerry Falwell's son have to step down from Liberty. And it feels like one of the benefits from putting in leaders who have high integrity and who live lives of integrity and truth is that then the people who are watching can trust that sort of Christian leadership. And we're not just, by the way, talking about at the General Conference within the Seventh-day Adventist at the Hyatt or the unions or conferences. We're talking even at the local church, our pastors
Correct.
and our elders, right? So that we each live lives of integrity because there are people watching. Do you guys find this to be true as well?
I do find that to be true, Jennifer, and I like what you talked about, the fact that people are watching. In the denominational work, and we're talking about the Seventh-day Adventist Church here, but that could be with any organization, that people are indeed watching. And they're watching in such a way that as they see the lack of integrity in a leader, as they see a leader take advantage of their position and maybe use resources that belong to the organization for their personal use, the persons who are watching have two choices to make. Choice number one, it could affect their faith and they could walk away. Or choice number two, when indeed they have their own opportunity to ascend into leadership, they will continue what was modeled for them.
So it perpetuates the cycle.
Correct.
Hmm.
So that people are watching is very significant. It does have an impact on those who see.
I once heard this three-step process, which I thought was very well put. It said, we as the Seventh-day Adventist Church have no standards for leadership. So we cannot exclude somebody from, we have
Membership.
no standards for fellowship. Let's get this right.
Yeah,
so
fellowship.
No standards for fellowship. Somebody can come, anybody can turn up to a local church, and unless they are disruptive, we have, no one can remove them. And it doesn't matter who they are and what they've done. There are no standards for fellowship. But if they want to be a member, then there are biblical standards for membership. Then, you want to be part of the business meetings, you want to vote, and all that. Well, then you need to live according to the principles of this community, and we take our principles from the Bible, so biblical standards. But there is one more layer, which is higher standards for leadership. And in leadership, you don't just need to live a life of integrity, you also need to appear to be living a life of integrity. Okay. It's that it's not enough for you just to live it. You need to avoid those circumstances and those situations where you can be seen to be doing something wrong. You need to avoid those as well and be cognizant of the fact that people are watching. The point of leadership is that you immediately become a model for that which you are doing. And to some people, that's too much, and that's okay.
And you have to manage perceptions.
Yes.
You have to manage perceptions in terms of your behavior, because there could be something that you're doing that you're totally entitled to do. And it is totally right to do. But is it expedient? Is it the best thing to do because of how it could be perceived? So those are things that leaders have to go the extra mile, the extra step in understanding the nature of their influence in those whom they lead. Ellen White, I recall a conversation, not a conversation because I wasn't along with her, but an article that she wrote that talked about stewardship, and that leaders are going to be held to a higher level of expectation because of the level of their influence. So their demands on their stewardship is related to the extent of their influence.
It's interesting that you talked about perception, because there is this idea in sort of PR that it doesn't matter what is true, it matters what looks true. And what you both are saying is it actually matters not only what is true, but what looks true. So even if you are living a life of integrity and truth, if it looks like you're not, or if you're putting yourself into situations where maybe that could be called into question, then that's wrong too. You also need to be cognizant of how you're presenting yourself to those who are watching you. What I don't want people to think is watching this is that leaders don't make mistakes. We're not what we're saying, right? We're saying that, all leaders make mistakes. We're human, we're sinful, we mess up. those are not the kind of things we're talking about. We're talking about living lives of integrity and truth and managing our mistakes in a way that is beneficial to, the people that we come in contact with. I think is what you guys would agree with me.
But isn't it true that there are some mistakes that your leadership does not survive from?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah,
So if you're in charge of resources and it becomes very evident that you are consistently mismanaging those resources in order to facilitate your own life or benefit you in certain way, and this is a moral failure, and sometimes your leadership will not survive that moral failure, and you will either be requested to, or the right thing to do is for you to step down, or others will get you out of that position so that you are no longer tempted, if you will, to continue. Paul, tell us more. How does the church deal with this? How does the Adventist organizations, how are they encouraged to deal with this moral failure?
Well, in terms of that moral failure, and first of all, no leader is infallible. Let's be clear. No person, the only infallible one is God himself.
Yes.
Okay. So people are going to make mistakes. And in terms of a leader, the higher standard to which they're held, yes, there are certain mistakes that they will make from which they will never recover. In other words, they would never be placed back into that role of leadership because of the mistake that has been made. Now, we're talking here particularly as it relates to money, finances. However, there are situations, and I'm just going to put out there because we're having an open and honest discussion, an in-depth discussion, where in our church, others have seen and are in positions of responsibility to address some of these failures that leaders might make. And rather than hold that particular leader accountable, what is done sometimes, that person is transferred to a different role or transferred to a different part of the field. And that indeed is unfortunate, because the accountability as it relates to a person's failure, a person's lack of integrity, a person's malfeasance, it's not performed, it's not done. And then they go to another location and it repeats itself over and over again. So it is important that those who have responsibility to hold leaders accountable do exercise that responsibility.
Okay, so Paul, I want to put two scenarios to you. The first one is let's say a senior pastor receives a new intern fresh from college, and the intern is doing something that is inappropriate, but they don't realize it's inappropriate. For example, after youth group, two of the teenagers need a lift home, and the pastor is more than happy to offer that lift home, and they don't realize that there is a perception of something inappropriate here. So essentially, the senior pastor goes to this intern and says, "Please, this is not good. Do not offer lifts for any teenager of any gender. This is not good. Without an adult, don't have a teenager in the car." Okay? Oh, okay. That's good. And he doesn't do that anymore. Correction made, done. The second scenario is, let's say another pastor, okay, not the intern, another pastor is sending through their mileage report every month, their expense report. They're sending things that are inappropriate, and the treasurer is watching. The local treasurer is watching, the local conference treasurer. And then eventually there is enough that they notice, I need to have a conversation with this person. You were saying before that people are put in positions of leadership in order to confront sometimes these difficult situations. So he calls the pastor and says, "I've noticed you've been doing this. This is wrong and you shouldn't." And the pastor says, thank you for this. I won't no longer do it. And then they no longer do it. And they're very careful with how they approach it. Now tell us, from your perspective, these interventions, if you will, is there a better way to do it? Should they be done in this way? And because it wasn't public, does it make a difference whether something is public or not?
Well, thank you for those examples. I think, first of all, interventions are necessary. And if we take the first example with the intern that might have been given rides or should not have been alone with another member of the opposite sex, or I think that's how you described it. and he's then counseled by his senior pastor, that doesn't necessarily look good. That's a part of the mentoring intern relationship that I believe would be necessary and important for that senior pastor to groom and to guide that young intern pastor, because he has been through this before. He understands the pitfalls of these types of behavior. That doesn't necessarily have to be a public display of intervention. That's a private intervention. Now, if the person continues and does not seek the counsel or doesn't abide by the counsel that is received, and something unfortunate happens, then you have another situation in terms of accountability relative to what has transpired and addressing that point there. But I believe the pastor, the senior pastor, does have a role to play in terms of guiding that young intern. What are the guardrails to set up to make sure their ministry is not disturbed or be affected by some unfortunate choices? But as it relates to the other pastor now, who is sending in reports to the conference, and each month might be padding the reports or might be making errors on the reports, we have to take it in two respects. Is that pastor unknowingly making a mistake and making an error, not fully aware of the policies, not fully aware of what needs to be done? Yes, then the treasurer needs to point out to that person, here's what you're doing. This is not correct. This is the way you should do it. And if the person says, okay, thank you, I appreciate the counsel, I appreciate the insight, I will now make the appropriate reporting in the future. That can stay right there. But it's different when you could have a situation where a person is intentionally trying to deceive, intentionally trying to gain more resources in a fraudulent way. Then I believe then that should be escalated to other discussions beyond just the treasurer and that pastor. Maybe talking to the ministerial person or to the president or the HR person of that conference to at least document the concern in terms of an intentional behavior to deceive and also to defraud the organization of its resources, of God's resources.
Yeah. Do you think it matters then, sort of, I mean, I have two questions. The first is, do you think that the treasurer or whomever is in charge of sort of the finances, so maybe it's the finance committee of the church or the treasurer of the conference, that there should first always be a kind of a private conversation? And my second question is then, as a person moves up within an organization, and I mean this not only from pastors if they move into the regional, like the regional the conference or the union, but also, you know, we have hospitals, we have schools, as they sort of move up within our institutions or that sort of thing, that matters too. So how we treat an intern or a local church pastor is different than how we treat an administrator in the different levels of maybe education, hospital, or local church field.
I think there are some universal expectations across the board for any denominational worker, whether they be a pastor or be a person who is on the treasury financial side or a teacher. There are some universal expectations of how to behave in certain codes of conduct. Now, I believe it may be, I hate to say it, but in the role that pastors play, in the role that certain leaders play, there's going to be a higher level of expectation related to certain behaviors.
Yes.
And so,
and there should be.
And I guess I believe there should be. So those who are the supervisors of those persons need to really take serious note of behaviors that they may notice that are concerning and address them early. Because the earlier addressing of these issues can probably solve some future problems or prevent future problems, I should say.
And that's why we have certain internships and that sort of thing for in all walks of life, right? I think we have, you go through an internship process, and we talked about the importance of mentorship last week. And I think it applies very much here. Correct. Is that our mentors are here to tell us.
Yeah, but I never thought of this in the way that you put it. This is, And I'm kind of processing this live. Let me think it through. So
But
if
while you're processing, Sam, let's make sure we understand. I'm going back to Jennifer's question, that there is a place for private intervention and there's a place for public intervention. And so the leader needs to be wise, and those in leadership need to be wise in terms of when is the which one for what time.
right. So you mentioned if it is established, if it is clear that it was an intentional moral failure, let's put it that way, they tried to deceive purposely for some gain, then you mentioned two steps here. You mentioned one step, but I wanted to ask about the second step. You mentioned documenting that. So, okay, so let's have a historical evidence with, at the appropriate place. The world doesn't need to know that yet, but at the appropriate office, you don't transfer somebody at that moment. No, let's keep them.
The problem.
Let's keep them close. Let's document it. Let's have the private conversation. And if they change and don't do that again, you saved that leader. They just needed that accountability, and you've saved them. Much like, well, let's leave it at that. Okay. I presume there is restitution too.
Correct.
Right. So
if you have stolen something, you need to pay it back.
Documentation, restitution, and I presume if it is, what's the word? Egregious enough, if it is, because if we're talking about, does it matter? That's another question. Does it matter? Amounts or even, does the circumstance matter, or is it a on and off sort of thing? If they did this, then they're fired. Or does the circumstance matter? You've got years of experience in this, and you've seen lots of different situations. In your experience, does it matter or not?
Really, it should not, because wrong is wrong. But I would dare say, in practice, there may be a scale of egregiousness, and then the response to that egregiousness would be scaled to what they see in terms of whether or not the person should be fired, on probation, things like those. So it's not necessarily a situation of 3 strikes, you're out. I mean, wrong is wrong. But I would say, in a practical sense, I would believe that the egregiousness of the situation or the matter at hand is probably taken into consideration. Because I've seen some situations where a person, whether it be just the amount or the circumstances surrounding the concern, may be put on probation or administrative leave without pay, things like those. On the other hand, I've seen situations that it was a done deal. They were fired right away. I've seen situations where it even led to prosecution.
Paul, I'd be very interesting to hear, because we've talked a little bit about the importance of internship and mentorship, of the local church pastor talking to his intern and saying, it's not okay. It doesn't look good for you to be alone with the opposite sex, or, and this happens in all levels of leadership. We have interns that come in and we advise them. And I'm wondering, how many little yeses do we see? I mean, it's not very often that you have someone who just all of a sudden makes an egregious mistake without there being any little signs along the way. And so I'm wondering about the little yeses that we say we overlook, or that we say, okay, that's okay ourselves. And, I've heard this analogy given when talking about inappropriate relationships between men and women, our adultery, where they say, okay, it's okay to text, it's okay to do this, it's okay to do that. And then when it comes to the situation, that big yes is a little bit easier to make, because you've said yes to the 100 things before it that weren't as egregious, or maybe on a face level weren't egregious or wrong, but in the circumstance they were. And I'm wondering, as leaders, as we're watching colleagues, as we're watching the people around us, as those who are in positions to hold us accountable, how many little yeses or how many little things do we sort of overlook or we excuse because on the face they're not. But then when we see the big yes, that big egregious mistake, we go, we really probably should have been paying attention to this other thing that happened.
You hit it right on the head. Whether it's in from the moral failure side or financial failure side, it's the accumulation of little things that then lead to the major thing. It just doesn't just happen. Particularly on the financial side, when I can quote now from things related to fraud. Okay, most times fraud happens because a person had an opportunity, maybe had some pressure, right, rationalized something away, did something, and they got away with it. Very small amount. And the next time they said, oh, well, okay, I'll pay it back. But then they said, okay, let me do it again. And they keep doing it. And little by little, they get to the point where it then becomes a larger amount. And that's when it all blows up. But it didn't start when it blew up into a major amount. It started maybe years ago. Little by little by little. So it's an accumulation of events. As you coined it, an accumulation of yeses.
Let me ask you about the benefit of the doubt, because sometimes it is very difficult to intervene when the person, if you're the leader and there is somebody that is working, that you are overseeing, and they're very competent, they're very necessary for organization. They are like a linchpin in your organization, and if you lose them, lots of things will be lost. And they know this. And so it's easy for you to turn a blind eye and to constantly give the benefit of the doubt over and over instead of intervening and having that difficult conversation. Because these are not easy conversations to have, right? They're very difficult. And I think that there may be many things that contribute to the lack of interventions on the smaller things that could redeem this leader for the future, even if it was from the beginning. Have you seen that happen? Sort of this constant benefit of the doubt being given.
I see that, and it's actually a function of being part of the same faith community, because all of a sudden you by default extend a measure of trust at the demise of proper oversight, because we share the same faith. We go to the same church, or children play together and they're in Sabbath school together. We went to the same church school. So because of that familiarity and that commonness within the same faith community, there is this extension of trust that can be actually concerning, because no controls are put in place, which really are designed not to catch people, but to protect people. But those controls are overlooked, and oversight is disbanded with in the name, well, I trust this person. I give them the benefit of the doubt. Why wouldn't I not trust them? We go to the same church together. Our kids played together. We went to the same schools. But that's a false sense of security, because just because a person is baptized, just because a person holds a senior role in leadership, does not mean that they are immune from temptation. It doesn't necessarily mean they're immune from pressures. It doesn't necessarily mean they're immune from opportunities that could then be able to take advantage of to relieve those pressures.
That's interesting. But I actually flip that to some extent on the hand. If you trust someone, if you work in an area of trust, then I know that there have been times when in our department that we've gone to each other and said, look, I'm concerned about this behavior, or I think that maybe this situation was handled incorrectly or something. And if you trust another person enough, or if you respect a person enough, I think that those situations are handled well. And if a person is who you think they are and maybe making a mistake, then they are able to look at that situation and say, you know what, thank you for pointing that out in me. I did not see that in myself, because look, we all have, like you said, we all have the potential to fail. We're sinful human beings. We have these things within us that we can fall through to temptation, and sometimes we see it and sometimes we don't. So if we can go to each other as trusted friends or colleagues and say, hey, look, I see this in you, before it gets to the level where we're talking about, right? I see this in you, and I would really ask you to maybe go and prayerfully talk about it to the Lord, or talk to see what's going on in you. I would think that hopefully, as a Christian leader, that you could take that as a positive. I mean, yeah, it's going to hurt and be awkward for a minute, because no one likes to be, slapped a little bit, but in the end, isn't it for our benefit?
One of the best presentations I've heard on this issue of ethics and integrity is someone who said no one. They started the presentation, and it might have been GCAS. I don't know, Paul. It was many years ago. They might have been you. They presented it. They started by saying no one who has been fired of embezzlement started out by saying, I am not a person of integrity. So they started off by saying that the people who have been verifiably stolen from different organizations, not just, not the church, they didn't start out that way.
No.
And they proceeded to, I think it was 6 or 7 things that are like the perfect storm. And the end of the presentation was, when these 7 things, when more than 3 of them become a reality in your life, pray more and watch out, because you are much more susceptible to taking shortcuts and to doing things that you shouldn't. And I thought that was fascinating. And it's things like, you have somebody who is sick in your family. So there's some health issues that are going on. Another one was, there are more bills than you can afford over the next 6 months. There are more commitments, financial commitments that you have. And it provided, 7 of these characteristics. When you've got more than 3 of them, watch out, because you could be tempted. Even you could be tempted was the sentence. So Paul, do you see that to be the case?
We see that to be the case. And we actually, in my world, there's a name for it. It's called the fraud triangle. And I've mentioned the elements of it before. It's opportunity. Well, first of all, pressure, which when you talked about a person is sick, or you have too many bills, or things like that. That's pressure. Then there's opportunity, in terms of, well, I now have access. I have now the means with which to be able to relieve this pressure by being able to access resources that are not mine. And then there's rationalization, in terms of, well, you know what? The organization doesn't pay me enough. So I'm really entitled to this. Or, you know what? I need it now, and I will actually pay it back later. So when those 3 things really come together,
watch out.
Anyone, including myself, could be susceptible. Everybody has their breaking point of pressure. And it's only by the grace of God that even when you break, you do not do things that would be outside of his will.
It seems to me that the only thing you can really truly avoid is the rationalization, because pressures will come. It's inevitable.
Yeah, sure.
Opportunities are already there, because we have a trusting system to a great degree. We have verification that needs to happen. Trust and verify is a good leadership principle. You trust, but you verify. But opportunities are there. It's inevitable that there will be. And in fact, we don't want to work for an organization where there is absolutely 0 opportunity, because then you have no autonomy at all whatsoever within the organization. But there are verification processes that will curtail that, controls that. So the only thing really is the rationalization. So when you begin to see yourself rationalizing why this may be a good thing for you to do, that's when you need to start praying and fasting.
It's interesting that you said that anyone can fall into this, because I think one of the most dangerous positions to have is, it can never happen to me. And so that you're so blind to your own susceptibility to sin or to pressure that you think that it could never happen to you.
It's that better than thou syndrome.
Right, because what I feel is that we have an enemy who knows every pressure point we have.
Correct.
And your pressure point may not be my pressure point. What you are susceptible may not be what I'm susceptible to. And so, but he knows. And if we get into this idea that this can never happen to us, we may be very surprised when it does. And it may not be in the way that it happened to someone else.
Correct.
But we have to guard against that. And I don't want to like make it sound like we should be ripping our clothes and, woe is me, but be aware that we are all susceptible to behavior if we are not relying on our Savior. And that prayer that you talked about a little bit.
Yeah. I want to bring another element, if I may, which is the necessity for a personal relationship with Jesus that is constant. It's like Sabbath school. The answer is Jesus. It doesn't matter what the question is. If the child says Jesus, they'll get it right. But I don't want to fall into that. But I've listened to a philosophy professor from the Federal University of São Paulo once, where he said that there is only love. Where there is no love, you need ethics. Where love doesn't exist, you need policies. And it is precisely in this fallen world where we are, where rules and policies and ethics and so on become important. Because the question becomes, if you loved, how would you act if you loved? If you loved your employee, you wouldn't need a rule that determines that they can have time off when they have a child. It would be the most obvious thing that they should spend time with their children because you love. But we don't live in a loving world. We have examples of love. So the question becomes, how would you act if you did indeed love? And if you are constantly in connection with Jesus and you understand his love for you and you extend that love to others, then deciding what the right path is most of the time pretty simple. Living with integrity is pretty simple if you experience that genuine love. And when Paul writes in 1 Corinthians describing what love is like, it's a very frustrating passage, because if you really think you love somebody deeply, just read that passage. It will get that notion totally out of you. Love is patient, love is kind, it keeps no record of wrongs, and all of that description, it shows you that you have a long way to go. So love becomes really important for you to love your leaders, love the people that you're leading, to love your family and those around you and so on. And it becomes this guiding principle for ethics. How would I act if I truly loved, Jesus and his church, the bride? Would I be taking resources that are not mine? No, I would not. Then I won't do that. What would you do if you truly loved? So that's something that I use in my personal life for making decisions and for avoiding the rationalization that Paul was talking about. Anyway, I thought I'll bring that in, this notion of personal relationship with Jesus, integrity, love, and ethics, and so on.
But I would presume that you're talking about a love that everyone is engaged in, that love, and not just an employer, but also the employee is also exercising and engaging in that love. Yeah.
Yes.
What a world that would be.
But
isn't that the new earth, right? What a world this will be, because at the new earth, that's exactly right. We'll still be engaged in meaningful work. We'll still be connecting with each other, but we will be experiencing that love. And that's probably why the 10 Commandments, when Jesus was asked he summarized them as love God and love others. And it's the 10 Commandments and the other rules, I suppose, are a descriptive version of what love looks like in practice.
I want to circle back to something that Jennifer said earlier in terms of failure. And I want to make sure we understand, for each of us on the line, and for anyone for that matter, that somebody else's failure, though it may not be similar to mine, we each have failures. Okay? And we're each eligible for God's grace. But many times, and unfortunately Christians, will look at others and celebrate another person's failure, and to castigate them and to chastise them for their failures, but not seeing their own.
That's very common, unfortunately. I think it's a misapprehension about just how far they are from Jesus. You know, Max Lucado had this analogy. He said, if salvation is jumping from, just jumping and reaching the moon, if that's what it meant to be saved, Michael Jordan could jump 6 feet, and you can probably jump a foot. Compared to the moon, it doesn't really matter that he can jump 5 times more than you.
Yeah.
If the objective is reaching the moon, in his analogy, it's to be just like Jesus is so far from us, like the moon is from us here, that it puts that into perspective, and it demands compassion. The only true reaction to a leader who has fallen is tears, because there's no glory in this. It's a sad moment, and the only way that the opposite reaction, any joy may come from a leader that has fallen, is if you don't understand just how fallen you are. Yeah.
I feel like.
What you
sorry,
just
go ahead.
said. What is said?
No, go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Is the only method by which, or means by which, we are able to blend compassion with consequence.
Yes.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Amen.
In fact, this should be the tweet that promotes this episode.
Yeah. Well, I also find it, and I don't want to be cynical in any way here, although that sort of stays on brand with me, but it feels like when we celebrate others' failures, that life has a way of humbling us. And I don't want to get into, I don't want to sit here and say, God will humble us, because I don't think that's it. But I think there is a certain arrogance that comes with rejoicing in someone's failure that leaves us open to humbling. And we are all humbled when we kind of least expect it or most need it. And I think what you said is true, that it is only when we realize what failure sort of we are in the eyes of, and in need of grace, that we are able to truly maybe put ourselves in someone else's shoes and say, hey,
yeah,
I'm sorry that this happened. Ravi
Zacchaeus wrote that God is the only one that can humble you without humiliating you. And it's amazing how God does that constantly. He is able to humble you without humiliating you.
Goes back to love.
Absolutely.
The love of God.
Yeah.
And it happens daily. Really, it does. I just lost my train of thought. So
there is another saying that is that I think it's Jordan Peterson who says this: tell the truth, or at least don't lie. And it's a great rule. And he says that you should never compromise what is meaningful for that which is expedient. So don't take advantage of a situation where you can tell a half a truth or a lie and you will get expedient results. You will get there quicker. He says you cannot contend with reality. You have reality is reality. And what you're going to do, you're going to describe reality differently. You're going to fight with reality. Do you think you're going to win? You're never going to win. So the more precise your speech is that reflects reality, the more destructive you will be. The less destructive you will be to yourself, because you're aligning yourself with that which is real. So don't compromise what is meaningful for something that is expedient. Don't play the short game. Sometimes telling the truth will set you back quite a long way, but it's worth it in the long term.
Correct.
So I think that a lot of extroverts have to handle that very carefully. I'm an extrovert. I score, Jennifer knows I score in the 98th percentile of extroversion. So I'm very much an extrovert, and it is the temptation of the extrovert to use words to advance, in the immediate future, to advance themselves. And that's why the world doesn't trust extroverts anymore, because as people move to the cities, extroverts had an advantage. We can gain trust in 5 minutes. We know what to say and when to say it so that in 5 minutes, people can trust us. And many extroverts use this for their own, to manipulate others. And so it is very difficult to trust extroverts intrinsically because of the way that they've behaved. So when you take telling the truth seriously, it means not extrapolating on stories. And when you say that so-and-so said this, you're very precise with what they said. But it's so hard not to exaggerate. It's a temptation that should be resisted, because in the long term, no one trusts somebody that is willing to say things just to have immediate benefits when they're not precise.
I do want to talk a little bit about restitution, because we've talked about it kind of generally. And I think that there is something to talk about a person with character, or someone who has learned integrity through mistakes, and how they handle that, how they handle the humbling or the consequences of their behavior. If you are a pastor and you have made mistakes, and you are asked to no longer be a pastor, or you are relieved of your job because of lack of integrity, is there a way to make restitution? And maybe restitution isn't what I'm talking about, because we live in a world where, I guess, cancel culture is sort of the norm, right? We have someone who makes a mistake, they say the wrong thing, and then they are canceled and we never hear from them again. But we believe in a redemptive savior, and we believe in redemption. Is there a way that if someone has made a mistake, that they can be redeemed and come back into leadership, or to lead again? Is there a path that they should take? Is there a way that we should be thinking as they try to make that sort of restitution and redemption to bring them back? What do you guys think? How can we sort of have redemptive spirits when we start talking about these issues?
I think to a large extent, it depends on how much they broke the principles that they agreed to follow. So if in our case, biblical principles, right? So if I said something, let's take the one case. I said something somewhere that was filmed, and it was interpreted in a way that I did not intend. It was taken out of context or whatever. They're using this, people are using what I said in a way that is not what I intended. I think that you need to clarify. You need to if the way that it was used hurt somebody, you should apologize for the way that it was used and that it hurt somebody. That's one element, right? And cancel culture, all you need is a tweet from 15 years ago and you're fired. So, if the media picks it up or Twitter picks it up. So I think that that's one thing. Different from that is if I did something wrong, and that wrong, intentionally wrong, and if that, depending on how grotesque it is compared to the values that I signed up for, that could have totally different consequences to something else that I may have done, which doesn't truly go against, goes less against the values that I signed up for.
I guess what I'm asking, if you're in a position where, we've used the example of embezzlement, or you've taken money or whatever, and you have been relieved of your job responsibilities in sort of a way that you were not asked to retire, you were removed, and then you have a change, you go through whatever steps. Do we have a system of redemption? Do you deserve, I don't know if deserve is the right word, are you able to come back into a position of leadership? How does that work within, and is there room for that even?
As you were asking that question, I was trying to think through that a little bit in terms of, can redemption and consequence coexist?
Mm-hmm.
Because if a person has done something wrong and he or she is remorseful and repentive of what they have done wrong, that opens the door and the pathway towards redemption. But I don't think it relieves the expectation and the necessity of consequence.
And do you think one of that consequence may be this side of the new earth, they will not be given access to the same position and or access to those resources?
Right.
Correct. Yeah.
Do you think in another, like, if I was a church treasurer, and I will tell you right now, please don't ever let me do that. I don't do math. So if I was a church treasurer and I ended up falling and taking money, and then I was able to pay back the money, I was able to go through the steps needed for redemption, am I able to lead in my local church? Like, even if I was never a church treasurer again, we don't want to put people into the same positions they were, because I do think that we are responsible for the gifts that the Lord has put within our responsibility, or the blessings. But I guess I personally believe in redemption with some oversight. Redemption carefully. So if a person is able to show restitution, they give money back, they show they can be responsible. Maybe they're not church treasurer anymore, but maybe they are part of a different ministry. They teach a Sabbath school, or they are able to lead family ministries. What do you guys think of that? Is there a way forward with this?
We have a story in the New Testament that people use when it comes to that, and I'm interested in Paul's opinion about this, and that's Zacchaeus. Because most people say Zacchaeus was, he stole money and all of this. But mathematically, it doesn't make sense. And Paul, I don't know if you've ever tried to audit Zacchaeus, but in his promise, he says, I will give half of what I have to the poor. Okay, so now he has half of whatever he has. Let's say he has $1 million, just to make it easy. Half of that goes to the poor. Now, Zacchaeus was a tax collector. So now he ends up with $500,000. And he says, I will give back 4 times as much to anyone that I have stolen from. And we usually assume that tax collectors do steal. But Zacchaeus points this out, and mathematically, if his fortune came from stealing, he would not be able to restitute people. So let's say that out of the $1 million that he started with, let's say that a quarter of it was stolen. Well, turns out that he cannot give back that same amount because he doesn't have enough now. So mathematically, he wasn't somebody who stole. And if he did, it wasn't anything of significance, it seems. So I think he was saying that just for perception, so that, he would, if somebody can demonstrate that I have stolen, I will restitute that money 4 times over. But his fortune would not be able to be sustained at all if most of it came from that. So
that depends, though.
Tell me.
It depends on the perspective in terms of what did he do with the money that he stole. He could have earned 4 times as much. Remember now, Zacchaeus know that he had, well, first of all, as far as Zacchaeus was concerned, he was doing nothing different than all the tax collectors of his time.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So he really arrived at an awakening to say, now that I've met Christ, I want to be different. And all that I might have done that I now realize that was unfortunate and inappropriate, I want to return it. Your math calculation probably has a way out, because he would have known how much he had stolen. He could have invested it somewhere and have made 4 times his wealth. So maybe to the extent of what he had earned, he wants to give it all back, to come back to a level of zero, that I no longer have benefit from anything that I might have stolen.
But doesn't, when he says, I will give up to half of what I have, I assume that includes all of those investments and everything else. So, right? So if that's the case, then if somebody comes and says, well, you have stolen this from me, because tax collectors at the time could, they were there was just a manual system, and they would say, you owe this much, and that was that. So they would pass on to the Romans whatever amount they needed, and it would keep the rest, presumably.
Now, I get what you're saying.
Yeah.
Now. So in other words, the math doesn't work on the half that's left over.
That's
it. To the extent, though, that doesn't necessarily mean that it wouldn't take a period of time to pay it off from properly gained means.
That is true. He doesn't set the period of time that is left for him to do it. That is very true.
But I do think the point is that he tried to make restitution.
Yeah.
And come back into grace, which is that possible?
I think that is possible and desirable, but you just need to know that this side of the new earth, you may not be given the same opportunities that you had before as a consequence of what you've done, and you just need to live with that.
Correct. And there's nothing wrong with that. Redemption is not distant from that type of approach in terms of being able to apply the consequence that is necessary and prudent. As opposed to saying, well, because you have repented, because you have provided restitution, we're going to put you back at the same scene, and pardon my language, the same scene of the crime.
Yeah. No. So as we're closing down this episode, I think it's been such a great discussion. I'm wondering if each of you can talk to me a little bit. Tell me what you think. How does a person become a person of integrity? Because we are all, most of us are leaders in some way. Even if we're at the local church, we still are maybe head of a family, or we are the head of a youth group, or we are the head of our group of friends. We're pastors or administrators, whether we work in the church or not. How do we live lives of integrity? And I'm going to ask Sam to start, and then Paul, after you're done your answer, if you could pray for us, I would really be grateful for that.
About 2 years ago, I read this book, and one of the rules was tell the truth, or at least don't lie. And I thought, let me take that seriously. I'm gonna live this out. And I realized that my record for the first year was 15 days following that rule, which is very surprising because I'm a pastor. I'm committed to the truth. Why was it so difficult? And I stopped counting now. I'm in the second year. I'm doing much better. But the reason why it was so hard is that if you notice, there are many things we say during the day that are not completely accurate. I'll give you an example. Jennifer, your office is right in front of mine when we work in the office together. And Brent, who's the technical producer that is hidden just underneath here, I asked Amy to come pick me up. We only have one car. So she came to the office and she was coming to park downstairs. I left my office and I walked out, and there was something that you and Brent brought up, which was really important. And we were both talking, all three of us, we were talking for quite some time. And 10, 15 minutes went by. And then Amy called, my wife, she called. I picked up the phone, and I was like, okay, hi, baby, I'll be there. I'm almost there, I said. Except that I wasn't. I hardly left my office, and there was still quite a walk to get to where she was waiting. And then I had to reset my counter from the days because I had said something that wasn't that wasn't true completely. And I'm telling you this story to show that I think you brought this up, Jennifer, if you don't say little yeses on an everyday basis, it will be very difficult for Satan to tempt you on something larger. So if you're very careful with telling the truth, or at least not lying in everything, it will be a lot more difficult for you to be tempted into something much larger later.
My response, Jennifer, in terms of how to live a life of integrity is simply this: model the life of Jesus Christ. Come to know him more and deeper each and every day. Follow his will, follow his lead. And, the very common term, what would Jesus do? I hate to use that, but that really is simple, emblematic of the life that we need to live in terms of the decisions that we need to make, the actions we need to pursue. Well, what would Jesus do? But we will only know that the more we come to know him, the closer we become to him, that the choices that we make would just be the same choices that Christ would make. So that's how we live integrity.
Amen. All right, Paul, when you will you wrap up with prayer for us?
Our Heavenly Father, we just want to thank you for this opportunity today to talk about integrity, to talk with my colleagues from the General Conference in terms about the I Will Go strategy of transparency and accountability, and how it relates to how we as a church can be successful in pursuing that strategy when we have the confidence of those who provide the resources to do so. Thank you, O Lord, and we ask that everyone who is in the hearing of this in-depth episode will be inspired to live lives of integrity, both as church leaders as well as members. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Paul, and thank you, Sam, for being with us today. I hope that you who are watching enjoyed our conversation, and that you are able to take some of what we said and apply it to your own life, or be able to talk to those around you a little bit more about it. I think that we've come down to really developing our relationship with the Lord is probably one of the best things we can do for living lives of integrity. And we will see you next week. For us here in the United States, it's Thanksgiving, so we will be talking about gratitude next week, and we will see you then. Have a great week. God bless.